In a giant hotel in the middle of nowhere, not everything is as it seems. One boy possesses the power to understand it, but does he know how to wield it? The movie begins with a car driving a great distance across several different terrains. When that is finished, we see a huge building from overhead. A man enters it and introduces himself as Jack Torrance to the receptionist. He then asks her where Mr. Ullman's room is. She tells him, and he goes there to meet him. Then the scene changes to a little boy sitting with his mother and speaking about living in a hotel for the winter. Then the boy, Danny, introduces his imaginary friend, Tony. He speaks for him while using his index finger. Tony expresses negative feelings towards going to the hotel, but Danny's mother tries to make him see things differently. We then see Jack speaking with Mr. Ullman. Another man joins them in their discussion. He asks Jack what he does for work, and Jack says that he's a writer. Mr. Ullman tells him that the Overlook Hotel closes for the winter until May. He states that the winters could be fantastically cruel, and goes over some of the things that need to be done to maintain the orderliness of the hotel. He adds that the only real problem that could come about here is a sense of isolation. But Jack tells him that it is exactly what he wants for his writing. Ullman is pleased to hear that, but then he says he has one more important thing to say before Jack becomes the caretaker. He tells him about the story of Charles Grady, a previous caretaker that went insane. He tells him how he had put his wife and daughters to eternal sleep because he very likely experienced something known as cabin fever. After the story, Jack gets slightly taken aback by it, but he also says that his wife will love it because she is a ghost story fanatic. In the next scene, Danny is in the restroom speaking to Tony. He asks Tony if his father will get the job, and Tony tells him he already did. Then Danny's mother picks up the phone that rings. On the other end is Jack. He tells his wife Wendy that he got the job and that she and Danny are going to love it there. Afterwards, Danny asks Tony why he does not want to go to the hotel, but Tony does not want to answer him, and still doesn't after being asked by Danny several more times. Then Danny gets an image of a large quantity of blood gushing out near some elevators, and also he sees two twin little girls standing for 1 second. Then the family rides in a car. Jack tells a story to Danny about a group of people that got snowbound and had to resort to flesh eating. Wendy disapproves of Jack speaking about such topics with their young son, but Danny tells her not to worry because he saw a program about flesh eating on TV. After the ride, Jack sits in the hotel, and Ullman comes to greet him. Wendy and he then get a tour of the great hotel. Meanwhile, Danny throws darts at a wall in the game room. He then sees the twin girls appear and looks at them. This time they stay for a decent number of seconds until they turn around, and Danny feels uneasy having had that encounter. Then Ullman shows Jack and Wendy their rooms, and then the hedge maze outside. About it, he says they should not enter unless they had 1 hour to spare to find a way out. After that, Ullman shows them the snowcat, which will allow them to ride across snowy terrain. And then, back in the hotel, they all step inside the gold ballroom. There, they get introduced to the hotel's chef, Rick Halloran. He asks them how they like the place so far, and then Danny comes in. This leads Ullman to take Jack with him while Rick Halloran shows Danny and Wendy the kitchen. The three of them then walk along the kitchen. While showing them the freezer, Rick calls Danny Doc. Soon after, Wendy asks him how he knew that, and Rick says that maybe he heard her calling him that. She says that it's possible, but mostly denies that she did. Rick then says that Danny looks like a doc. When he takes them to the room of canned foods, a ringing sound begins. As he speaks to Wendy, Rick asks Danny if he wants some ice cream with his mind. When they are out of that room, the others come back to greet them. When they do, Rick asks Danny if he wants some ice cream, but this time with his voice. The rest leave elsewhere once again, and this time it is just Danny and Rick together. They come to sit at a table and enjoy some ice cream. Rick then asks Danny if he knew how Rick knew his name was Doc. When Danny does not respond, Rick asks if he knows what he is talking about. After more silence from Danny, the chef mentions how he and his grandmother used to speak without opening their mouths, and that she called it shining. Then he asks Danny how long he was able to shine. But more silence from the boy prompts Rick to ask why he chooses to remain silent. Danny then mentions that the reason is Tony. When Rick asks about Tony, Danny states that he has a little boy that lives in his mouth. They then converse about Tony for some time, and Rick asks if he told Danny anything about the Overlook Hotel. Danny does not say much, but then asks Rick if he is scared of this place. And Rick says that he isn't, that some places are like people. Some shine and some don't. He states that the hotel has something like a shining. This leads into Danny asking if there is anything bad in this place. We see Rick hesitate to give an answer, but then he says that when something happens, it can leave a trace. However, Danny keeps pressing into the uncomfortable topic and asks about room 237. With this question, Rick makes an odd face for some time. He tells Danny with some force that there is nothing in that room and that he should stay out. 1 month has passed. We see Wendy rolling in a food tray along the hotel. Meanwhile, Danny rides his tricycle brazenly inside. After she rolls it into Jack, they speak about loving the hotel as they eat. Later, Danny and his mom go inside the maze. While they maneuver themselves inside, we see Jack looking at the miniature replica of it. As he looks at it, the replica turns into the actual maze, and we see that Danny and his mother made it to its center. The next scene has Danny riding inside again. He passes many rooms until he comes near room 237. He stops riding and looks at it. Its curious nature makes him get up and come to it to touch its handle. When he does, he gets an image of the twin girls again. Then we see Jack engaged with his work on the typewriter. Wendy comes in and tells him that the weather forecast told her that it was going to snow tonight. But Jack responds by giving her a slight attitude. When she tells him not to be grouchy, he tells her that her presence breaks his concentration. And at that point, he gets considerably angry. He takes one of his papers and rips it apart. And then he tells her not to disturb him there, and that she should get out. Another day is shown, and Danny plays with his mother out in the snow. While they do that, Jack stares at them through the window with an absent-minded expression. Then Wendy walks the interior of the hotel and enters a room where she radios some personnel that keep in touch with the Overlook. She asks them if the phone lines are down, and the man there tells her that they are. Then he tells her that if they have problems there, they should not hesitate to call them. He adds that they should also leave the radio on at all times. Danny rides his tricycle again. In a certain hallway, he encounters the twin girls. For the first time, they greet him and even say his name. Then they tell him to play with them. As they say this to him, Danny sees images flickering of them lying lifeless on the floor. This scares him to a good extent, and so he covers his eyes. When he uncovers them, the twins, along with the ghastly images, are gone. He then tells Tony that he is scared. But Tony tells him that it's just like pictures in a book, it isn't real. On another day, Wendy and Danny watch TV in a room. Danny asks his mom if he can go to the other room to get his toy car. Due to Jack sleeping in that room, she does not let him go at first, but after another plead from him, she lets him. When Danny enters the room, he finds that his father is already awake. Danny asks to get his toy car, but Jack tells him to come to him first. Danny then sits there, being held by his father. The boy asks him why he isn't sleeping, and Jack states that he can't. Then he tells his son that he wishes they could stay there forever. Danny asks him if he would ever hurt him and his mother, and Jack asks if his mother said that to him. Danny responds that she didn't, and Jack then tells his boy that he loves him. In the following scene, Danny has many of his toy cars out on the carpet. As he plays with them, a ball rolls in. Danny then gets up and walks until he sees that the door to room 237 is open. He enters it, and we do not see what happens. Then Wendy checks some things in the Overlook's boiler room. While she is there, she hears Jack yelling loudly from a good distance. When she comes to him, she sees him yell in his sleep. She tries to wake him up and he falls down. When he does, he wakes up and looks terrified. He tells Wendy that he just had the worst nightmare he ever had. He dreamed that he ended her and Danny. But he did not just end them, he ended them in a horrific way. He further says that he is losing his mind. Then Danny starts coming into the room. Wendy comes to him and sees that something is wrong with his neck. While she observes his wound, Jack stares at them with that absent-minded look. Then she blows up at Jack and accuses him of doing that to Danny. She badmouths him before she leaves. After that uncomfortable happening, Jack tries to collect himself by entering the ballroom. He sits at the bar and says that he'd do anything for a glass of beer. He would even sell his soul for one. When he covers his face with his hands and then uncovers them, he greets someone named Lloyd. We then see that he is not hallucinating, and that there really is someone there. The man asks Jack what he will be having today. Jack mentions that he has money in his pocket. Then when Lloyd prepares the drink for him, Jack finds he has no money in his wallet. He ends up asking how his credit is. When Lloyd says that it's fine, Jack drinks. Then he talks about his problem with Wendy. As long as he lives, he says she will not let him forget about what he did. Some time ago, he was drunk and dislocated Danny's shoulder. Then we see Wendy running into the ballroom scared. She comes to Jack, who is now sitting there by himself with no Lloyd, and tells him that there is a crazy old lady living there with them in one of the rooms. This causes Jack to ask her coarsely if she is out of her mind. Wendy ignores his rude questioning and adds that the lady tried to strangle Danny. In the next scene, Rick lies in bed watching TV. Then the ringing sound takes place, and through his shining he senses something. He becomes terrified. We then see Danny being out of his mind. While that dissonance takes place, Jack enters room 237. He walks into the bathroom and finds a female in the bathtub. She then gets out of it and starts walking to Jack. He has a very satisfied look on his face because she is unclothed and appealing to him. When she gets to him, they start kissing. Jack is overtaken by lust, until he looks in the mirror and sees the reality of the situation. He then takes himself away from her, and sees that she is actually a grotesque old lady. At that point, she starts laughing evilly, and Jack runs away and locks her door. When he returns to Wendy, she asks him what he saw. But what he does is lie to her. She keeps asking to be certain, but he tells her that there was nothing there in room 237. Wendy does not understand and asks how Danny got his bruises. Jack looks at her then with an upset face and says that he probably gave himself those injuries. Wendy denies that as a possibility, but Jack tells her that if it wasn't what Danny told her, then that is the only possibility left to consider. Jack then starts giving Wendy an attitude because she wants to leave the Overlook. He tells her that he will not let her ruin this opportunity, and then storms out. As he walks, he knocks down many dishes. Then he sees party balloons in the hallway. Meanwhile, Rick Halloran calls those personnel with the radio that Wendy called earlier. He tells them that there is family at the Overlook, and they might be in trouble. He asks if they could call them and see if they're okay. The radio personnel tells Rick that he will, and that he should call them back in 20 minutes. Then we see Jack enter the ballroom, and it is much different from before as it is heavily crowded with people. He sits down at the bar and speaks to Lloyd. As he gets his drink, he gives Lloyd money this time. But Lloyd tells him that it's no charge, orders from the house. Once he has his drink, Jack gets up with it and tries to join the party. A waiter then passes by and spills his drinks on Jack. He then apologizes and attempts to clean the mess off him, but then states that they need to go to the restroom to more properly clean it off. Then they enter the restroom. As the waiter cleans him, Jack asks him what his name is. The waiter tells him it's Delbert Grady. Jack gets taken aback as soon as he hears that name. Then he starts asking Delbert questions to acquire more information. Shortly after, he asks him if he was ever the caretaker, but Mr. Grady shoots back with a negative. After some more questions, Jack takes the towel from him and tells Delbert who he is and what he did to his family. Delbert looks at him for some seconds and then says that he does not remember that at all. Then he says that Jack is the caretaker and has always been that because Delbert was always here. After he settles their identity, Delbert tells Jack that his son is trying to bring someone into this situation. Jack asks him who, and Mr. Grady tells him a cook. When Jack tries to understand how, Delbert says to him that Danny has a talent and that he will use it against him. As they speak, Delbert Grady tries to tell Jack with great subtlety about what needs to be done. And as he tries to bend his mind, he tells him how he corrected his wife and daughters when they attempted to stop him. In her room, Wendy walks around and speaks to herself about what she should do. A sort of paranoia has taken hold of her. Then she hears Danny yell "Redrum" from his room. She goes there and speaks to him, but he tells her that Danny is not here in a different voice. We realize that it is Tony speaking through him. Wendy tells her son to wake up, but he does not. In the following scene, Jack walks a hallway and hears people calling through the radio. He then walks into that room and makes the radio non-operational. We see Rick after that. He calls again to the radio personnel, and they tell him that they tried to reach Jack or Wendy, but they couldn't. Rick then makes a decision, and shortly after we see him riding on a plane. When he gets off the plane, he rents a car and drives through the snow. The scene changes to Wendy telling Danny that she will go and speak to his father for a short while. She leaves and takes a baseball bat with her. When she enters Jack's typing room, Wendy observes that he is not there. Then she walks over to his writing material and looks at it. On it there is written the same insane statement over and over. She keeps looking through the papers and becomes terrified at the great size of that insanity. The statement repeats hundreds of times. Then Jack appears behind her and asks her how she likes it. Then he asks her what she is doing there, to which she frighteningly responds that she wants to talk. He gives his okay to that and asks to talk about what. Wendy states that she cannot remember, but then Jack reminds her what she wanted to talk about. It is about Danny. She slowly starts walking backwards, and Jack just as slowly follows her. While they walk, Jack presses her about Danny and asks what she thinks should be done with him. She tells him that he should go to a doctor. Jack states that she is concerned about their son, but then disbelieves that she is concerned about Jack. He then yells at her for not understanding his responsibilities towards his job. As he goes on about it, they both slowly ascend the stairs, and Jack becomes more intimidating. Then he finally threatens her, and in response, Wendy gets defensive with her bat. Eventually, she strikes him on the head with it, and he falls and rolls down the stairs. He then lies there in a passed-out state. We then see Wendy dragging her husband into the storage room. She leaves and locks him in there just in time when he wakes up. He yells to her to release him. At that time, Wendy takes a knife. Then he tells her that he will forget about what she did to him, and even starts acting like he is hurt. After that, Wendy describes to him her plan about getting out of there with Danny. But Jack maliciously tells her that her plan will not work because he tampered with the equipment such that it will not help her. Wendy then runs out to the snowcat and sees that it has been ruined in the engine area. After some time of sleeping in there, we see Jack get awakened in the storage room. Delbert Grady speaks to him from behind the door. He then tells Jack that he did not take care of the business they discussed, and then he says that he has doubts about him. Delbert adds that Jack might not have the belly for it, but Jack asks him for one more chance to prove himself. To that, Delbert states that Jack will have to deal with this problem in the harshest possible way, and Jack expresses his enthusiasm for it. Then Mr. Grady asks him to give him his word, and Jack does. The door then gets unlocked. The next scene has Rick Halloran arriving at the Overlook Hotel in a snowcat. Then we see Danny saying "Redrum" over and over again while his mother sleeps nearby. He then takes her lipstick and writes that word on the door in all capital letters. After he's done that, Danny starts yelling "Redrum," and his mom wakes up. She then looks in the mirror, and it is revealed that "Redrum" spells murder. As soon as she sees that, Jack starts axing the door to their room. Wendy takes her son to the restroom to hide from Jack. She makes Danny escape through the window, and tries to escape that way too, but cannot. Afterwards, Jack breaks through the door and enters the room. This brings him to only one door separating him from Wendy, and he starts slamming that door with his axe. Wendy is terrified at the sight and sound of the happening. When Jack creates a big enough opening, he puts his hand through it to unlock the door, and that is when Wendy brings down her knife on his hand. He pulls it out as a reflex, and then hears from outside that someone has arrived at their secluded area. This prompts Jack to leave the room and see what is going on out there. As he walks as a cripple through the hotel, we see Rick enter the building. He yells if anyone is present. Jack walks towards the lobby and hears Rick's voice. When Dick makes some good distance into the lobby, Jack surprises him by coming out from behind one of the pillars and ending Rick with his axe. As soon as that happens, Danny yells in horror. His father hears that and starts coming for him while yelling his name. As Wendy makes her way through the hotel by herself, she starts encountering some disturbing happenings that she did not witness before. Meanwhile, Jack follows Danny outside into the snow. He yells his name and sees Danny run into the maze. Jack goes after him, and they spend a good amount of energy running through it. Then Wendy sees the body of Rick lying in the lobby. When she turns around, an unknown man stands with a cocktail in hand and a bloody head. He tells her that it is a great party. After that, she enters a room full of skeletons. Danny then starts backtracking into his previous snow steps to not form new ones. After he backtracks for a decent number of steps, he hides himself in the snow. And then Wendy comes to those elevator doors and sees the many liters of blood gushing out. Her experience at the Overlook Hotel is now complete. We then see how Jack reaches the end of Danny's snow steps, but his son is nowhere to be found. He then goes in some other direction to look for him. After that, Danny comes out of his hiding place and follows his steps out of the maze. Meanwhile, Jack gets lost and can't find his son. When Danny leaves the maze, he is greeted by his mother. They get inside Rick's snowcat and drive away. Jack is then left alone to move around injured and confused in the snowy maze. After a while, he cannot take it anymore. He has become trapped and succumbs to a frozen finish. The final scene takes us to a picture in the ballroom. In that picture, we see Jack Torrance standing in a huge crowd of people celebrating July 4th in 1921. It is as Delbert Grady had told him, he was always the caretaker.